Hello, we are live. Thank you for tuning in. We have a special feature today. I met this person through Instagram and we interacted, and I love people who are passionate and who care to have conversations. And I reach out to a lot of people, and it's so rare that people actually respond. This person did. You may see they have decided not to show their face. That's totally fine. I'm thankful just to have a conversation with them. I don't know essentially anything about them. I intentionally left it that way because I wanted this to be an authentic, raw, and real sort of conversation. We did title it Life, Liberty, and Trans Rights because those were some of the themes that my guest, Augustus, suggested that they've been talking about in their circle. And I'm very curious to see what they might have to say. So, with that being said, I want to give Augustus an opportunity to give any sort of intro they want about themselves, about anything, and then maybe we'll dive into some philosophy. Go ahead.
I'm just excited to be here and kind of see where the conversation goes. Much like you, I kind of have a handful of platforms. I kind of flow through engaging people in conversations, and in general, I'm just really interested in just new ideas, kind of like ideas I haven't thought about yet, and I haven't really heard about, and when they pop up, which is sometimes maybe a little too rare, but when they do pop up, I'm engaged in them, and I like them, and that's kind of like what my operationals are.
Okay, no, I'm the same way in that I feel like I know I have blind spots, but I can't find them myself. I literally need other people to help me find my blind spots. And so you got very specific into some philosophy. So, for example, one thing you brought up was um, bodily autonomy rights, abortion rights, um, and then also Locke's notions of property via his second treatise. I don't know how to say that word. Um, and so it feels like you might have some preformed thoughts and notions. And I would love to just let you diatribe as much as you'd like. Is there anything in particular that you want to
um,
jump into?
I've just, I have friends and just people I engage with and interact with all over the spectrum, political spectrum, cultural spectrum, the spectrum, and yeah, like you mentioned, of late we've been dealing with just kind of what constitutes property, private property, like how is it, what is the grounding of it, and we had kind of read a little bit of Locke. We, as I think I mentioned, off camera here, we read some Thomas Paine and some of his ideas of property, and talking about that, it kind of mixed in a little bit with some of the conversations with other people I was having about trans rights and sort of the subjectivities that, like I call them trans subjectivities, that sort of flow through individuals. And it was just kind of starting to sort of feel out connecting points between concepts of property and concepts of trans subjectivities. And one of the interesting things I kind of was thinking about was the, I want to say obviously, and sometimes it's not obvious to whomever you're talking with, but and from where I'm coming from, obviously there's a lot of pushback of late against trans individuals, trans theory, a lot of legislation enacted and being proposed to sort of um, I don't want to say like impede, but impede certain speech rights and certain rights of movement that individuals have due to their subjectivities. And it's kind of thinking about the connecting points between property, concepts of property, and the sort of concepts and theories of trans subjectivities, and sort of how they mix and touch, and just started thinking about kind of subjectivities as property itself. Like it's we have this notion of intellectual property, um, but started to think about how subjectivities, whether trans or quote unquote normal subjectivities, are in fact sort of intellectual property that is somehow generated, whether it's generated via an individual or generated via societal mechanisms. There seems to be something dealing with that identity seems to be a constructed property. And if that's the case, and that's an interesting sort of rabbit hole to go down to, but if that's the case, how does that property connect then to other notions that we have of private property in terms of, the rights of others recognizing our property in a particular way, the rights of doing things with our property without being hindered by legislation or the state. So that is just kind of to me of late, and I say that, I mean like the past like week, sort of things I've been thinking about.
I really enjoyed that. Thank you. You sort of classifying someone's identity as property, to me that's a sort of novel concept, but I like it because for a few reasons, I guess. The implications I kind of want to maybe dig into at a potentially granular level, but um, I want to bring up a few different layers here real quick. The surface layer I would call the culture wars, which to me I think are intentionally manufactured to divide the population. So I've got this shirt. I designed this shirt. It's no division. Because although you and I might disagree, I think we might get into some disagreements at some point, but on some things, we need to not let these culture war issues divide us because there are just, to me, deeper wars like class wars and
Mm-hmm.
even beyond that, spiritual wars. And for people who are not necessarily spiritually inclined, we can just leave it at class wars, and that's enough to should be enough, in my opinion, to be a uniting or rallying sort of um, call. But so I identify as an anarchist. Um, so I do believe that the individual is the sort of beginning point of property. You own your body. That's bodily autonomy. Um, and so extrapolating that a little bit further to someone's identity and then what rights that person's identity has. I'm also really big into Eastern philosophy, the yin and the yang. Um, misgendering someone or dead naming someone could be considered an act of aggression on someone's property if you were
Yes.
to. Um, but then what forces could arbitrate such gray? And I brought up the Eastern philosophy of, the yin and the yang. It's the black and the white, but nothing's black and white. Everything
Yeah.
is gray. And so bringing the trans rights issue into this, I think that's a hugely, it's an issue with a lot of force on both sides.
Yeah.
And that force is being weaponized against the masses.
Yep.
And so, what are trans subjectivities?
So, I mean, at a very like big picture level, on my Instagram, one of the postings I have that is something to the effect that I do think that trans rights, the trans issue is an extraordinarily vital issue in contemporary worlds. It is an issue of how much freedom does a person have in their subjectivity in terms of how they are interacting with their own body and other bodies and institutions. Like, how much freedom does somebody have inside their head? And I think that over the past, since the yeah, sort of since like Judith Butler's gender as a performative sort of idea started to percolate up a generation ago or so, this has grown and it has entered the forefront of the political realm in how, and like you said, like the cultural wars that start to, that build around this and other issues. But at its biggest and easiest level, to me, it is what sort of freedom will society, the state, others, oneself, what sort of freedom do we allow our own subjectivity to sort of flow over categories that society has accepted and sort of thinks is natural, quote unquote. So the big picture to me is how free can we be in our own heads? And the second sort of tier question is then what are the, I don't want to say the rights that one has with the freedom in their own head, but maybe rights slash expectations of how we plug into the social with that. And so the question of like what is a trans subjectivity, we have, I think, like the most explicit and obvious in today's cultural and political climate is trans subjectivities are dealing with gender issues and sexual body issues. And those are very interesting conversations, but I don't think they're exclusive. Trans subjectivity conversations are not exclusive to that. Um, trans subjectivities, to be simple about it, if I'm from a particular location in the US and I have a football team that I've been following for decades and decades and decades, and I like identify, I have the stickers, I have the flags and the t-shirts, and I'm watching in my emotional states and my financing, my purchasing decisions, all of my whole life, my identity is embedded inside of being a certain particular sports team's fan. And then I move, and over a period of a decade, I'm now a different sports team fan, and I'm doing the same things I did with the other one. In that is an example of a trans subjectivity. I'm moving my identity and shifting it, both decisions that I make, but also decisions that sort of arise or operationals that arise and I onboard just through a new social group that I'm hanging out with. So trans subjectivities, I think, are subjective experiences that we have that sort of accumulate into macro experiences of self, and then somehow identity gets stuck onto it. But the trans subjectivity can take off that label and try out different ones. And again, at one level, that's expected and it's normal. We transform our loyalties from sports teams or from one state to another or from one city to another. Um, and we do that in, I don't want to say micro ways, but we do it in very non-controversial ways all the time. I mean, we take on a new job or even leaving home to go to my employment. My subjectivity, the experiences I have at work, the ethics, the ethical systems I use may be the exact opposite of the sort of ethical systems I use when I'm at home. So we do have fluidity in our subjectivities. When they start to connect and touch upon categories, for the lack of a better word, categories that are dear to people like gender, sex, religion, that sort of thing, that's where I think contention pops up for something that is very, very normal. And people start to, entrench themselves into tribes and sort of solidified belief groups about what should be um, a particular subjective experience. I don't know if that made sense.
I no, I have so many notes that I want to try and string everything together that you said. Thank you. This is phenomenal for me. You mentioned Judith Butler, um, and so that kind of tells me or makes me want to ask, do you have a political identity? Because I want to start digging a little deeper into things, but I want to kind of have a
Yeah,
little background on you.
I would say that I would say I would kind of I'm an anarchist, but in a very particular sort of yes but yes but yes but anarchist. Um, I feel I'm wary of the state, whether that's the institution of a government and or any other sort of state mechanisms, which I do think in at some level a stable psychology in our own head runs like a state, like a tiny little state in our head, that has its perfect little borders and its line, and there you are, sort of like the monarch inside your own head. So I'm weary of state sort of apparatuses, and I'm also, yeah, kind of, I begrudgingly will accept that there may be moments when components of state apparatus are healthy for an individual. Like, if we want to say that the little monarch inside my head is a state, that there may be moments when that monarch making a unilateral decision to see itself as a whole unified thing, that may be very helpful for me to procure food or a mate or to keep a job or something like that. So there may be moments that bubble up when almost a spontaneous state coming together to dictate a particular moment is helpful for an individual or a group of individuals. But I'm weary of that. I like Chomsky's how he talks about it, that in that it may not be so much that we need to reject all sort of top down power, but it may be the more that the top down power must be open to be challenged, and it must legitimize itself. That unlegitimate top down power is unhealthy and dangerous. So I can have a parent grab, a daughter's hand to control that daughter crossing the street, and that's a legitimate use of power. And the parent would be able to legitimize and explain why, in that spontaneous moment, she took control of the child. So I'm both wary of, so again, probably rooted in anarchy and thus wary of state apparatus, but open to the possibility and the reality that at moments a spontaneous state coming together is healthy, as long as it's legitimate.
Okay. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I'm just going to say fuck Noam Chomsky. Um, Moving
I
on.
I just like that one sort of sentiment that
Yeah, no,
it's
he's done
yeah,
great work, but he ruined it all. We won't get
yeah,
into it.
that's cool.
But so it sounds like you're like a left-leaning person. And so I want to bring up back the trans rights issue, but with property rights in mind and kind of connecting all of it.
Hmm.
I believe that individuals actually have the right or should have the right to discriminate. And because it is their body and they should get to choose what they do with their body, and that institutions should not have the authority to exert force upon anyone to do anything.
Hmm.
Um, how does the right to discriminate work in with your worldview?
So, there is a negative connotation to discrimination, like to discriminate. And there's also a more, I don't want to say positive, but there's a more scholarly connotation that, discriminating between two different shades of color, discriminating between two different slight variations in tone is what musicians do and what artists do. They sort of discriminate something. So, as a root principle, I don't think there's anything inherently bad or evil or detrimental about discriminating actions into the world. I think the danger comes when the discrimination puts someone else in danger, whether individually in danger and physical danger or social danger, which, again, I do think we are social animals. I think language is deeply rooted inside of us as a profound operating system, and that language, our operating system, is at its core a social operating system. Language. I didn't invent my language. I'm borrowing all these concepts. I play with them, and it is that operating system, that whole sort of that field of the operation system that transcends any given individual and links them as a social circuit that is an aspect of humanity. And so if there is an injurious movement that reaches a particular threshold. And I do think the thresholds are very individual inside all of these nodes connected. If there is a discriminatory action that harms someone within that social circuitry, it is an individual harm to that person. Now, like I mentioned, I do think every single act of a possible harm from one to another due to a discrimination probably has to be realistically, would have to be handled on an individualistic level. Um, and obviously, in a world like in our contemporary world, that's extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, at times. Um, but again, I do think that we have the right to discriminate because we need to do that. Um, and it's not a positive or a negative action that the human being, the human mind does to make its way through the world, but it can have positive and negative results. And the negative results would be, I would speak of them as results that are hurting or bringing harm to someone else.
Okay. Um, so I'm let me ask maybe this question. Would you consider a doctor refusing to give a child hormone therapy to transition? Would you consider that a harmful discrimination?
Um, I would, so again, I think, so I'll give two extreme examples. And I do think a lot of this has to be handled individually. And a lot gets lost when the necessity of having a one size fits all legislative act, there's something that's lost in that. But, I'm picturing a child who is, and I don't even know how this would work medically or physically, so it's all going to just be abstract. But I'm picturing a child who is in a psychotic mode. There is a chemical discrepancy, a chemical imbalance in their body, maybe possibly due to, let's just say, past interventions dealing with body and trans rights and stuff like that. And this child is brought to the emergency room in a mode of psychosis. Um, Extreme heart rates, 200 beats per minute sort of thing, like, or seconds, whatever it is. Just, and there is a testosterone injection that they can give to a female, or a particular traditional masculine hormone that could be introduced into a biologically female body who is already kind of undergoing transition from female to male. At that moment, if a doctor sort of refused and the child, say, passive cardiac arrest, or in this psychotic mode, performed some damage to the room that then injured or killed that child, to me, that would be an issue. If there is a primary care doctor who has a new patient.
I lost you. Did you cut out your audio? You were in the zone. We're having technical difficulties, ladies and gentlemen. Let me see. Let me see. You muted yourself. Did I mute you?
Did I? Can you hear me now?
Okay, I can hear you now. Yeah.
I totally did mute myself. I was moving a pretzel and my finger hit the keyboard. Damn pretzels. But
Oh, so delicious.
I think at a moment, you have a primary care doctor who has a new patient and or a current patient, and the patient comes in and says, for years I've been feeling this way and I want to begin transitioning. Um, and the doctor says, I'm not comfortable with that due to my beliefs or whatnot. I don't think that would be a discriminatory moment. So I do think, again, I think that there's, like, individually, this sort of issue needs to be addressed. And at the large scale, like, what kind of laws do we have in terms of, I mean, there's first off that there's the law of the allowance of that. Can a parent and or a minor start to do that? That's one aspect of this. And then the one that sounds like you're getting into in terms of discrimination is, does a doctor, in the example I'm using, have the right to say no, and or the right to not say no at particular moments? And again, I think it's an individual, basis. Like I would hate, I don't, I think at one point there's a, for the, so I'm going back to the emergency room doctor. A child is brought in a motor psychosis, and there is, masculine chemical X that they can introduce, that's normally used in, in transition therapy, that sort of stuff. And a doctor, their belief system says no, but in this moment of crisis, a code that they have consented to as an emergency room doctor, in my example, I think that code that they agreed to would override a personal belief at that moment. 2 hours later, once the child stabilized, maybe they can get someone else in here. But I think it's sort of akin to, open heart surgery in an emergency room. The doctor's going in there, like, this thing needs to occur within the next matter of minutes or the patient dies. And that doctor says all of a sudden, no, I changed my mind, even though I consented to be like the lead surgeon on this, all that sort of stuff. It's there's something at that moment where a code that they have consented to and agreed to prior, in my opinion, should kick in to until the situation is removed from a crisis situation.
Okay, I don't want to get like bogged down. I can hear an echo now. Let me check my settings. But I do maybe want to. Okay, how about now? No. Okay. Yeah, the echo is gonna really bug me. We'll just push through. Or actually,
And I think that this is where metaphors are very
hello.
important.
Well, okay, let me get this.
Okay.
I think that was an extreme, not even real example, because I don't
Yeah.
think, and so that's not a great, maybe argument, but I don't want to get bogged down in that.
Yeah.
But I do want to connect it to another topic. But that echo, oh my gosh. Sorry.
No worries.
I'm a little aspy, and so little things can just trigger the shit out of me. Okay, that's better. Okay, excuse my language. I want to just kind of transition, pun not intended, but I love it, into a little bit of a different, I'm going to call it peripheral topic, sort of. I want to bring up the spiritual war, but we'll go here to another place first. Sort of medical fascism, medical tyranny. This is where I begin to, I piss everybody off. Like, I have no real core group of friends who I share philosophical values with, because I use the word fascism, and then everybody's like, Andrew, you're exaggerating. And I'm like, George Carlin did it 30 years ago and you all clapped. But when I'm trying to do it from a realistic perspective, it frustrates me, because we can't have the conversations we need to have. I think, so much about how America is being operated right now, it's very fascistic. The connection between our corporations and our government, and then the huge police state that enforces it all, and not even getting into international affairs. Right. And so, I think I want to bring back sort of the culture and class wars a little bit too. We have this cost of living crisis. We have, medications that cost so much more. Everything costs so much more than it needs to, because of this bureaucracy and the kickbacks and the lack of transparency, and essentially because of the fascism. But we're in this place where, and here's the spiritual war component, where I believe so many people have had their minds, their bodies, and their souls hijacked by, propaganda, by manipulation. But we are so fucking sick, mentally, physically, and spiritually, as like a nation, but also the planet is just it's hurting right now, and the people are hurting. Um, and let me try and get back on point. I'm sorry. Do you have any faith, or are you like a materialist? I guess, what perspective do you come at the world from?
I would soar, I wouldn't say I'm of any particular religion. Um, a, a lot of aspects of a lot of different religions are interesting to me. I'd say that I don't, my ontological, my metaphysical sort of leanings are that there is. I'm not a materialist. I may be panpsychic. Um, I do think that the biology of the body is not a little factory that produces consciousness. I think it's more, if we're going to use some sort of material object rather than a factory, which is like, sort of a capitalistic metaphor, and thus the concept of the brain producing subjectivity perfectly tracks with the history of capitalism and our whole social value system and how it in production. But if I'm using a material sort of object, I think the body is more a sort of radio that picks up consciousness as like a signal, and that every radio is sort of built a little different. Every body is built a little different, and the brain's the neural networks, the plasticity of the brain, that unique sort of infinitely connected sort of circuitry of the brain and the neural networks, the countless neural networks that move through an individual brain. I think that sort of does something to the signal, which is why consciousness, like why we have individuality as a sort of phenomenon that my beliefs are different than yours, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of like spirituality or religiosity, I'm not in a particular camp, but I'm not a materialist. And I would say again that there's something that I think consciousness is of the world at different degrees, and that we are of the world. So our biological body resonates with a consciousness at the same time that it is sort of picking up the signal or tapping into the various degrees of consciousness that are sort of out there. And I don't want to say out there, but that are here, like the molecules, the atoms. Physics does a really good job of, I'm totally just lifting this from, I can't even remember who it was I was reading, but an essay. But physics does a really good job of sort of describing what we'll say, quote unquote, material does. And in that description of a action, it gets turned into a noun. So the carboning of a carbon atom, that carboning gets turned into a noun of carbon, and thus we think it's like a little pellet or a little thing that's actually there rather than a process. And I think the material of the universe is, even as it's described by physics, is not things. It's a force, an interaction, a consciousness of a certain degree. I think gravity, like two planets in interaction, there is a very low level degree of awareness there. That gravity is awareness of bodies in space, and reacting to it. It's not the level of awareness that we experience, but it has its own sort of degree of awareness.
No, I dig it. I track it. My guy Steven, one of like my best friends, this guy that I've just recently met, we're soul brothers, but he loves panpsychism. So he's going to be stoked to hear other people talking about it. But then right before you said all of that, you said you brought up the C word. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Are you anti-capitalist? Are you one of those people?
um and all of a sudden I'm getting echo now. So I think that I think capitalism is a particular state. It's a particular form of a state apparatus. Um, then thus I'm wary of it, as you know, in my anarchist leanings. Um, I do think at times, as I mentioned, there are moments when a spontaneous appearance of a state um, is helpful and or healthy as long as it's legitimate. And thus, I think that there are moments when the spontaneous appearance of capitalism is helpful and appropriate. But as a sort of, I don't want to say lifestyle, but as a sort of monolithic value system, both in how value functions and how value gets generated, I do think it's monolithic. And I would be I'm weary of that, and I see the dangers of having a monolithic value function generating apparatus. And it does, and it's an invasive one. You know, I remember the days when my parents would need a babysitter, and so they would just go next door and hire like the 14-year-old kid to babysit us 10-year-olds or 9-year-olds. And now there's multiple businesses that do that you go on and you basically look through the applicants of babysitters in your area. They have the information. It's turned into a product and a commodity. And so it's and families, it's an invasive thought system. It's a thought system that works in particular ways of how value should be understood, how value should be treated, how decisions regarding a particular manifestation of value should occur. I'll use another big word, ideology, and it's a solidifying one. It attempts to invade any area it's not already in there, including family relations, friendships, governments. I would hold that I think a thriving society, a thriving group of people is one that has a plurality of values and a plurality of what generates value and how it actually functions within that social group. And to be simple about it, reducing everything to the bottom line and reducing everything to the dollar amount and reducing everything to the flow of a market diminishes other value generating centers and other value functions in a group.
So help me out here, because what you described to me wasn't really capitalism. It was more of the fascism that I talked about earlier.
Yep.
So when I think of capitalism, I think of property rights and free exchange of goods and services. So am I thinking about capitalism incorrectly? Is there a different word I should be using?
I mean, so there's definitely, so in terms of just getting property, getting material from my hands to your hands in a legitimate way, like whatever the laws or the rules or the norms of that legitimacy are, like there are millions of ways to do that. I can gift it to you, I could sell it, you could steal it, all just a tons. I could sell it, all of this stuff. I think capital has just there's a lot it has as its sort of tenets and its value structures. One being that something is made to be sold, and thus a market has to be constructed for that. And the market has to deal with desire and the construction of desire. So I have to start, as a seller of a product that is specifically made to not be used by me, specifically made to be sold. I have to sort of, I don't want to say invade. I have to manipulate. I have to toy with someone's systems of values, and I have to make them value something. I mean, I think we are long past the stage that we seek out the things that we need. Like the things that we need for
you're
a
framing
vast
things.
majority of us are easily met, and I think that our consumer system now is founded on desire and the construction of desire. And
you
I think that's
projected.
what I mean when I say capitalism. Not free exchange of like I need a shovel so I can dig a hole, or I need food, or I need cement to I need cement to pour to make the foundation of my house. Like that is turned into capital products, but there are other ways of doing those exchange that are not capitalism.
Well, so you two things didn't quite answer my question if I should be using a different word, but then also you projected a lot into or onto capitalism that is not inherent within capitalism. Like when you said that somebody had to manipulate another person's value system, that was like, whoa, hold on, Turbo.
Well, I have
This
to.
this is where I think it's so crucial
Yeah.
if you care about fighting the culture wars. Like we have, this is to me the biggest issue that they're dividing,
Yeah.
keeping the classes divided on, is that we cannot talk about capitalism properly, in my opinion. I think everything comes down to this. Like the trans things are good at distracting people from this. So I love that we talked about the trans thing.
So,
Um,
like when Marx is talking about capitalism, and he has the MC M square MCM prime, like I think there's something to that. Like that money turns into commodity, which then turns into money primed for the person who's making the money in the first place. And how that money, how that more money gets produced is via the commodity, and it's not just happenstance that that occurs, and it's not the generation of that. I mean, no one's spending, no one's spending, let's just say, billions of dollars to produce a product that they hope will sell. And there are there's analytics out there that say, we can project that in 3 months, this product will still be popular if you start production now, and that's that sort of stuff. But I don't think in the contemporary world, any producers that's spending like that much money, or basically, I mean, people on Etsy, like they have social media to sort of sell brands, and part of branding is a desire that needs to be generated, and if it already exists, to be stoked.
but
And
that's
I don't think anyone's
commercialism.
just taking that. I don't
That's
think anyone's just.
weaponized commercialism. That's not
Yes, yes,
capitalism.
yeah. So I
And
think, so
so,
then again, like the other word probably, but I think in common conversations about our economic system right now, um, I mean, people like DeSantis and Schumer, like these are the words they use: capitalism this, capitalism that. And definitely there are more nuanced terms that can be used to describe very nuanced exchange and value systems. So like consumerism versus capitalism versus mercantilism, like that sort of stuff. But as a general apparatus, I think one party constructing the desire of another party, which has a lot to do with our current macroeconomic system, is detrimental to the party whose desire is being manipulated and or generated for them, rather than it arising spontaneously from them.
I actually don't disagree with that. That what you just said, I agree with that so much. But here's where I think also the culture wars get us really well divided. Is
Mm-hmm.
that and you brought up Marx. I'm more of a Rothbardian person who is like
Yeah.
and antithesis to Marx. Rothbard says that it is in fact the state and the elites and the ruling classes that manipulate. All that manipulation you're talking about is the ruling class and the state working together, the elites working together to enact that fascism I talked about earlier. And
Mm-hmm.
so they keep us divided, and they use, in my opinion, this is where I get a little conspiracy theorist, but I'm uh, they use collectivism as a tool to manipulate people into playing the game of consolidating power and resources into a centrally planned economy that just is fucking awful for everyone. I don't know how old you are. If you want to share it, that's fine. But I'm
How about
37.
your age?
Yeah, and so over the last 3 decades, I've seen nothing but just the collapse of what could have been a really cool country. Um, and so I agree that there are entities manipulating desire, demand, but there are also entities manipulating money in general. We haven't even talked about money
Yeah.
as, uh the monopoly, the state which holds a monopoly on the creation of money,
Hmm.
right? So how is that capitalist? And so let's and I'm so passionate about this. Let me just go a little bit more. I'm so passionate about this because I do see the potential for a better world, a so much better world. But foundationally, that better world needs to honor property rights, and it needs to honor the free exchange of goods and services. And so, if we need to make a better word, I would love for us collectively to create a better word to just sort of cover those two topics.
Yeah.
But then you mentioned Marx, so this makes me want to like talk about property even further, if possible. In that, I'm not as well read on Marx as you are. I don't read like I haven't read Das Kapital. I just can't. But there's like breakdowns of the types of property, right? And
Mhm.
so true Marxism is just so complex. Do you believe there are different types of property and that, certain things shouldn't be used for certain efforts and endeavors?
Yeah, I would, like, so yes, the big answer is there's different types of property. Um, and much like earlier when I was talking about sort of the necessary individual um, analysis of case by case, I think it's very much the same for property of I think about, I mean, you think about just the property that's sitting on a table, and the table itself. You got phones, pencils, computers, all that sort of stuff. And all of that exists in a different sort of flow of leasing rights, property rights, and the amount of people, the amount of labor that goes into any particular sort of assemblage is just insane that we all call it the same word, property. Like, and it's, and I'm picturing in my head like little kids with their cell phones at school, like, this is my property, you can't touch it. And then, like, come on, that's not actually your property. You're just leasing this, essentially. And just the complexities of how the assemblages of material sort of flow in our contemporary world, in terms of the rights that we have to them, the rights that others may have to them, the rights that other things that are not humans have to them, like animals, and or the rights that animals may have to not have those objects around, like uranium or some sort of toxic chemical X being dumped into a lake or something. It's a very massive uh, conversation about the rights to property and the rights to not have property around you.
Y- It's a massive conversation if you try to include everyone, but
Yeah.
it's a very small conversation if you include yourself and your community.
Yep.
And so it's so funny. We're almost like we just individualism and collectivism. And so, um,
And so here's an interesting, like, so I'm down in Florida, and we just went through two last season, Helene and Mitchell. And Helene really hit a lot of people, like, in the area I was in. And to me, I'm an optimist towards, I'm just an optimist, and maybe I should not be, but I am. And it was neat to see right off the bat, and it happens all over the time, like the neighborhood coming together, like our local neighborhood coming together, like the 100 households immediately popping out, immediately saying, hey, at 4:30 we're having a community meeting. We all got there. We all made sure, by a show of hands, who has power, who has water, who has food, who knows who has any medical expertise. And we were kind of cut off for about 7 days from the larger community. And it was neat to see people babysitting kids and sort of trying to keep their education going as the best they could, so that parents can volunteer to. We had to dig out. We had a massive, some water came in and took out the little bridge that connect us, and so the water changed the channel. So we were trying to clear all the mud and silt from the bay out of this channel, so that we can kind of get just a muddy road going across where the bridge used to be. And it was just, it was the sort of subconscious organization that was occurring there. Very anarchist, a spontaneous movement. Everyone sort of not being coerced into doing anything. But it was interesting when it came to material like property, like shovels and water pressures and that sort of stuff, and food. And there was this subconscious flow of property changing hands for particular reasons and then coming back. And there wasn't, and this went on for about 2 weeks, and there wasn't any, this is my property, this is my property, this is my property. There was a moment of crisis in which the definitions of what we commonly operate on with property blurred and dissolved. And in my eyes, that crisis moment was put in because our food supply was threatened, our social health and physical and individual health, we didn't have access for ambulances and whatever, was threatened. Water was cut off and threatened. Our communications, like the cell phone tower that was near the bay, kind of got damaged, and so we didn't have cell phone for about 4 days. Those basics that need, you want to talk about Maslow's triangle of basic needs, but those basic things that we need were limited or absent. And so the definition, the operationals that we normally use on property dissolved because we were in moments of crisis. But what's fascinating to me is that any given moment on any given day, there are millions of people in America who that moment of crisis that we were going through, so that we were being real loose about our definitions of what personal property is. For millions of people every day, they're in that moment of crisis, and they just live like that. And
I
that's
don't.
to me, it's so sad, but it's so fascinating how our community, as a middle class community, we're in this moment of crisis for about 2 weeks. And then it sort of solidified, and all of our normal definitions and operationals dealing with property kicked back in. We were making clear lines of what was mine, what was yours. And to me, that tapped into that there's something, our relationship to property and how it's generated as personal property is a lot more fluid. I hate, that's a trigger word nowadays, but it's a lot more fluid than a lot of people make out to be.
No, I agree, and I like your story, and I actually want to give my own little story. But first, I want to just harp on this idea that there are millions of people in moments of crisis all the time, and I believe a majority of those moments of crisis are actually manufactured
Yeah,
by the state and the ruling class and the elites who have created us to be weak, sick. Like I continue to harp on, physically, mentally, spiritually, we've been attacked, we've been poisoned. I myself, I need to lose weight, I need to be better about my health, but we collectively are very unhealthy, and I think that shows in the fact that we have so many homeless people, and we have so many people struggling, and we have so many people who, in my opinion, should be doing more. We have so many people who should be doing more. We have people who love to virtue signal, who love to make Facebook posts, and who love to. I live in the Seattle. Well, I live in a van, so I'm actually just dog sitting right now. But I live in a van. But I kind of travel in the Seattle area, and they got their protests, picket signs up
yeah,
protesting Elon Musk, but they'll literally walk. I'm gonna get loud. They'll literally walk past homeless people to go protest Elon Musk. It's like, you were fucking sick.
yeah.
I'm sorry. I hate the champagne socialist progressive types who virtue signal, and that's all they do. But I want to give a little story, my own little story on property and how it has a fluid but also tangible sort of element or component. I do a little bit of construction work, like day labor. And so often there will be between 2 to 4 different guys on a job site, sometimes different companies. But in this particular group, there'll be 4 of us. We're all part of like the same crew, and we all have different tools that we bring to different job sites. And in the moments of working on a specific job, we will often share our tools because it's like, hey, man, you got this tool. I need this tool for this little job. Cool. Thank you for sharing. And it is this sort of cool communal effort. However, at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the job, there is a balancing and a reconciling that occurs. Hey, where's my fucking hammer, bro? That sort of thing, right? Because
Mhm.
these tools are expensive, and these tools are an investment with the expectation that that investment has a return. And I think that is also a sort of subconscious human sort of activity and endeavor that we know that if we want to survive, we have to invest our personal resources and the resources we're able to interact with around us to. And this is where I believe modernity, I don't want to say modernity failed, it was a necessary step. But as we move past modernity, past post modernity, um, we've been trying to conquer the planet, whereas we should be learning to live in alignment with the planet. And so I am a big hippie, even though I might have some potentially right wing sort of views. I'm very much a big hippie. I very much think everybody who should have access, the opportunity to go drop acid in the woods, go do mushrooms if they want, if they're psychically available. And so we have the need to survive still deeply embedded within our biology. We're still in. I believe we've been around for what, many hundreds of thousands of years, and we've been evolving. I'm not like a Christian. Like I don't believe in the New Earth theory. That's fascinating stuff. But and so this ability to manipulate material reality in the way that we can now is very, very, very new. And so we're having to now integrate old primal patterns with new technology. And in addition to, evil people trying to manipulate us. And so I love that we're having this conversation talking about property because, like I said, I do believe the future is going to be founded on property rights and the free trade of goods and services. And so I want to talk about like my goal in life. I want to own a few acres. I want to have some goats, some ducks, some chickens.
Mhm.
Is that, I mean, and I totally think that that should be allowed. And I don't think I should have to share at my property. I feel like I should be able to trade and barter and transact. But the central banks, oh, do you have thoughts on the central banks? Do you go deep into any of those rabbit holes?
I mean, to me, I don't too much. It gets wrapped up a lot in like the institution sort of thing. But it's so with the goal of having your 2 acres or your handful of acres and the animals that are, I'm imagining, are producing eggs and maybe, I don't know if you're vegetarian or not, but you're slaughtering some pigs and you're growing them for like food and that sort of thing. It's it's I I'm similar in my simplicity of goals. Like I just want life to be simple, and I just that sort of stuff. And I work towards that simplicity, and I don't want to say simple. I work towards that flow of a particular life. That's much like yours, but with some slight differences. But it's something I do think about. I have a pig, and this kind of goes back to John Locke and how property arises, and it's to me it's there's this overweighing towards Locke and his sort of property ideas in relation to moving forward in history and why it is we can have private property. And because in the second treatise, it's a handful of pages, that chapter on property, and the arguments are extraordinarily simple and easily, like, to take them apart. It's very easy, but there are some sort of fundamentals there, like property starts with the body, and then you mix your labor in with some material out there, and that sort of becomes yours. And then he makes these massive jumps that, you know, all of a sudden I have flour, you know, I have corn, I have crops, but I didn't do that labor. I put the labor of the seed down, but I didn't do any of the labor to make the plant come up. And so right there, that begs, you know, there is an interesting divide there that others have sort of addressed. You know, like in that moment, what is the labor? What is my labor mixing with? My labor is mixing with carrying the weight of a seed and digging like an inch deep hole and then putting the seed in there and covering it back up. That was my labor. And that's what I mixed with it, like that degree of effort or whatever we want to call it. And then that thing produces, you know, an orange tree or an apple tree, and I can sell all these apples for $7,000. And it's an interesting, to me, there's a divide there about where Locke's grounding principle of where private property comes from. Still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Interesting. Sorry, my system there. But there's an interesting gap between where his sort of idea of how property even gets generated ontologically into the world. Like what he's talking about there is ontologically, how does property pop into the world? And he has like the mixing your labor with the material world, and that gives it a value that the natural world did not inherently or automatically have. But if the tree grows inherently, naturally, how it's going to do anyway, you didn't mix any labor in that at all, but you're selling all the apples for money. And like, that's an interesting gap in his ontology about how that thing, property, pops into the world. And
I don't know if it was you or Locke. I talked with Chat GPT a little bit about it, but I haven't read it yet. But you're just kind of oversimplifying this a little bit.
well, I think Locke oversimplifies it.
Because, you know, you don't just put a seed. Some seeds you can just put an inch in the ground and you're good to go. But there's
Yeah.
like so much more to farming. And then on top of all of the investment, there's not a guaranteed yield of return.
Yes. And so, and he doesn't talk about risk, and he doesn't, but then that starts to entail like, how does risk enter into the ontological genesis of property? And does it automatically? So if I take any risk, am I automatically creating property in something? And then like, what are the you know, what are the quantifiables of that? And so I think what I'm getting at is that there is the sort of experience I had with the storm and the experience you have with the tools, like where there is this sort of below the normal, when everything's normal operating of how we treat property. I think property itself, like the ontological entity of property, has a particular like I don't want to say life, but it has a particular function when it interacts with us that is more in line. I mean, this is what I would hold, is more in line with the experience of our 2 weeks of crisis and the experience of getting the job done with the tools. Like, I think that's how property flows. It kind of has a nebulous connection to an individual or a group, but it also has a nebulous connection to the commons, of returning back to the state of nature, of getting the human, a specific human's labor out of it. And there is that dynamic, again, like the Locke says, we mix nature, you know, 2 parts nature and 2 parts human labor. I think property itself as an ontological entity is in a tension dynamic in which it wants to return to the commons. It wants to be reused over and over again. At the same time that human individuals, when they're supercharged and everything is normal, are trying to sort of sway the balance towards them individually. And I think in those 2 moments that you and I spoke of, the work site and the crisis after the storm, is demonstrating that those ontological parameters of what property, I don't want to say wants to do, but the tensions that it has within it, of returning to nature and or capitulating all the way into a single individual who can do whatever the hell it wants with it.
And so I don't still disagree. This is so interesting. But like, I want to highlight one theme, the work site cleanup, or the work site and then your community cleanup. Both
Hmm.
of those were without any coercion or force or
Yes.
whatnot. It was all voluntary.
Yeah.
Voluntarism is another word I use, or I try to use, because it's like capitalism and anarchism both kind of get a lot of shit. So now I'm like, I'm a voluntarist.
I like
But
that.
and I kind of want to bring back panpsychism briefly a little bit, and mention again this whole concept of living in alignment with the planet. How I picture living in alignment with the planet is a lot of how you detailed how things want to return to nature. um, but I think we talked about the risk of investment. I I think the risk of investment is one justification, not the only, but one justification for the concept of profit, profiting off of efforts. And now, do I think profiting is okay, but I think also when we look at the mega corporations who are in cahoots with the government, consolidating power and resources for the elite friends, I can see how profit is demonized. Um, what do you think about the concept of profit in general? Should all profit be banned?
I don't actually think it exists. I mean, and I don't want to use the term surplus value, but I just want to. I almost want to say it's profit. It's privatized value. So it gets privatized to the boss, like in a really generic socialist critique. And so I don't think like profit actually exists. I think what exists is that some sort of value gets privatized by somebody, and that value is there, and now it's a matter of who will privatize it and who has a rightful claim to privatize it. And so like the risk is not simply taken, and this is where like the sort of the graph or the matrix of quantifiables would get so infinitely complex of like how much risk does an employee who moved from Chicago to Indianapolis to take a job, and like and they're only making X of in relation to what the boss is, and and their like yearly earnings, and like what kind of what are the quantifiables of that risk. And that's hard. And but I do think that so I don't think profit exists, but I do think that the sort of privatizing of value and the individuating of value into an individual and or a group of individuals is something that occurs. And then to me it would just be a matter of trying to find out how fair that disbursement is. And I certainly, risk would be a part of it, but even at that point, the quantifiables of how you determine, the exact degree of risk any component or any human in that organization was taking. And again, it's infinitely deep. Like the risk of my marriage, because I'm going to show up to an hour to work this week to work on this special project at a moment when the marriage is just teetering, is a massive psychological and financial risk for me. That if my the marriage, that's not a true story, but if the marriage collapses, like the amount of lawyers and finding new houses and la 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 la, that's a massive financial risk. And that happens with like every single employee and every single human involved in a business organization has all of that going all the time. And so to me, part of I don't want to say the evil of the system, but part of the detrimental effects of the system is that it does not take into account that risk. It only valorizes and validates one particular or a handful of particular flows of risk, like the risk of investment, the risk of X, the risk of Y. But there are all these real risks that are a hell of a lot more heavier than the risk of, a billionaire of investing $300,000 into something. And again, like even that statement, I don't know what the billionaire's state is. Maybe like again, like it's just so. And I wish that we could be so complex. And some of my optimism about contemporary technologies like Chat AP or Chat or AI and stuff is that we can start getting more and more nuanced about where are the risks occurring in terms of distributing um, like value after a product is sold or a service is accomplished. I don't
I
know if
like
that was
that.
I don't know if the answer or not to your profit question.
No, it's really no, it was. And it actually it helped me reframe sort of my concept of profit. But I want to, for the record, first state that I hate the mega corporations. I don't like hate the
Yeah.
billionaires in like the eat the rich sort of way. Um, I think a lot of them benefited from a lot of them who exist today benefited from an already broken system and just played the game that they were sort of normalized to play.
Hmm.
Um, so much of the system, you called it right, the system, it's
Yeah.
been, and this is where it's like Noam Chomsky, fuck you, but also manufacturing consent. They normalized a very, very, very broken system that a
Yeah.
lot of us play. And
Yep.
so it's so funny. I'm not a leftist, but sometimes a lot of the things that they say, I'm like, okay, I can get down with that. Like, decolonize or deconstruct in the institutions, dismantle the institutions. They say dismantle the patriarchy, but I think we need to dismantle the institutions. You say you're an anarchist, but where I then just passionately diverge from the leftists is that like they think they just need to retool the system. So it's like we need to remake the systems and redirect them, where I think the systems are in fact the problem themselves. When I
Hmm.
think of profit, I think of sort of a synergistic reward that you yield from interacting with the environment around you. So I hate the mega corporations. I do think that the world will still have big companies, when the system does finally fall, but I don't think it's going to be anything like it is now. I think we're going to see a lot more decentralized communities and whatnot. And so the planet, should be the focus, should be the mission. In sort of my opinion, I love Buckminster Fuller, how he wrote the book Operating Manual for
Yeah.
Spaceship Earth.
Yep.
um, I think a healthy person who is physically, mentally, spiritually healthy sees the planet as this just beautiful gift that we have been giving. The panpsychism thing, we're
Hmm.
all conscious, we're all connected, we're all like co-creating together. And so the farmer is, I worked at a tractor supply company for a little bit. That really reinforced my desire to work with the land. Meeting farmers are some of just the most amazing people. And sometimes they might not seem like smart or intellectual, but they are very wise. And I know that there's a current sort of anti-intellectual sentiment among sort of the working class or the more agrarian or the more farming working class, but them investing their time and their literal resources into farming to produce food. The goal is that they invest something into the planet then rewards them for their effort synergistically.
Hmm.
So like monocropping, bad, like our,
Yeah.
our current farms, we're not taking care of our planet very well at all. I will agree with you leftists on that. Like we are just destroying this planet and we need to treat it better. And so, one thing I love about this conversation is that we're like different, but we're also like definitely agreeing on a lot of things, and it's been awesome so far. It's been about an hour. I don't know how you're feeling. I don't know if you want to keep going. If there's anything more like that you really want to get out, how are you feeling?
Oh, I'm feeling good, and I have time, and maybe to loop back or something, but I do think that like someone like Bucky, with just his quote unquote wild ideas about society and architectural structures, and like I do think that he has a trans subjectivity. It's just not affixed to the what we commonly are fixing it to today. But he has a movement of his subjective experience that is going over clearly drawn categories of what a building should be, of what a society should be. And to me, that is a transsubjectivity. And again, it's a subjective experience of how this thing, the body, this mind, whatever, the soul, how this thing is interacting in connection and in flow with that thing out there. And even if there's that difference between the two, like that's to me a trans subjectivity that flows over commonly established and reinforced barriers. And of late, the barriers and the categories, I won't use the word barriers since that may be triggering some, but the categories of sex, gender, that sort of stuff, and then the institutions that we build around those categories, of late, that's what's getting the notice, because that's what trans subjectivities, vocal ones, have been sort of talking about in the past decade or so. But at root to that conversation that's been going on with transgenderism is trans itself, the trans subjective experience of moving past enforced categories. And a lot of them are enforced, like you said, like the state and these sort of the manufactured consent, the building of subjectivities that you're supposed to have. And then there's this prefabricated subjectivity that you just onboard, and you're just the perfect, Red Sox fan, or you're the perfect American, or you're the perfect Democrat, or the perfect Republican. And there are these onboarded subjectivities labeled with an identity that we can just, kind of like little technologies, just download them into us, and we can run on those. And, those, people like Bucky and just I'm at a loss for other names right now, but they just have whatever it is, they're moving beyond and over those boundaries. And to me, that's needed, and that is kind of what trans subjectivities do.
I'm almost there. I'm trying to visualize. I've got a visualization growing, but gosh dang it, the trans thing. It's oh boy. I guess
and it weirdly, again, I think I don't know what the word is. I'm going to say capitalism, but there's a value system or a value function that will grab onto something like, and then turn it into a product, like revolution. The revolution will be televised, sort of thing. There's a system that can onboard its own its revolutionary pushback and turn that to neuter the revolution, can turn it into a product. And that is certainly happening in the application of trans subjectivities now. A handful of years ago when Target was selling shirts and Budweiser, and they obviously got all the pushback and stuff like that. But yeah, that was definitely neutered and transformed and turned into a bizarre caricature of itself to sell product to a particular demographic, usually leftists or Democrats. So it's not to say that just because something gets turned into a product and or a talking point doesn't mean that at root that raw thing, that it still exists, but it's not actually the product yet. It has not yet been shifted, and it can probably not actually ever be commodified. That thing is still out there. Like that true trans subjectivity is still out there. I mean, there's still people in this world today who are trans subjects who are not involved at all with gender issues. Like their trans subjectivities, the experience that they are having, and the categories that they're flowing over and flowing around and dissolving, they're just other categories that have nothing to do with categories of sex or gender. But they're still at root that sort of same bubbling energy that in one way gets aimed at issues of gender and sex, and another way gets aimed at issues of what does an architectural structure look like. Another, it gets what does a natural relationship between trees and the soil. And we have all these categories of what we think they are, like all the trees are competing with the smaller trees for the sunlight. And then you have that transsubjective individual or group that or assemblage that then says, wait a minute, they're not actually in a competitive model, they're in a cooperative model. And that the older the tree gets, yeah, they're blocking out some sun, but they're able to transfer like all this sort of fungal nutrients to the younger ones quicker than younger trees. And like it's just those trans-subjective assemblages, individuals, groups that push over boundaries. And I don't want to use the word innovate because it has such like connotations with making money off of some sort of innovative profit or a product, but they have a way to go over boundaries. And that again in a market-based economy that can disturb businesses, and you get some businesses who will suffer and the new ones will grow. And in social structures you have pushback against norms and value systems that this going around the boundaries and the categories pushes up against and causes friction. But trans subjectivities in my head and how I understand them, that is what life is. It is just a unencumbered flow of just connection, 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 connection. And there are certainly systems in place that will try to prune and stop those connections from happening. But the trans subjectivity moves and is constantly trying to connect, especially connect to the things that are on the other side of the boundary or the category that says, don't connect to this.
Okay, I like that. I wrote down on my notes this. We've been dancing around the subject the whole conversation, but there are, and you've touched on it, there are people who are trying to prevent the population from transcending the old paradigm because the
Mhm.
old paradigm serves them mightily. And it is at our detriment. It is at the working class, at the average, the normal citizen's peril. And so, yeah, they are trying to prevent people from transcending. And I want to say this not to ruffle any feathers, but just to say it. I think the explosion in the trans identifying population is actually more of a manifestation of the previously mentioned physical, mental, and spiritual battle that's been waged on people. I think the true number of trans individuals is a lot lower. And unfortunately, because of the way that this issue has been weaponized, we're unable to really have any conversations around how to handle. Well, see, the thing is, I don't even think collectively we need to handle the trans thing. That's the problem, is that it should
Yeah.
be a community. It should be a community thing, in my opinion.
And I
I
think
don't.
what's interesting is that it really is like, and I don't know, like, who but in my social group, I know parents who have trans kids. And the way that we speak about it and talk about it, the parents are, they are in a fluid position as well. Like they're open to, to kind of paraphrase, like, maybe this is a phase, maybe it's not. I'm okay with either. And I think that openness to whether, because as I mentioned, any revolution, any trans movement, any transcendent movement is going to try to be pushed back against and commodified and put into the system so it benefits somebody. And that certainly happens with transgender issues. And maybe a kid is just going through a phase. Obviously, like once biological, like eerie, I don't know what the word is here. I'm having a brain fart. But changes to the body that cannot be undone, there's an issue there. But for the vast majority of people claiming a transgendered sort of subjectivity, um, there's no body modification outside of makeup, and there's no permanent body modification. But I like that. I like the openness that the parent has, and I think that happens because the parent is seeing the individual. And like you said, this is not a trans issue for the parent. It is a personal, an interpersonal issue. And I wish that I know obviously, someone who doesn't know any trans kids, they're not going to have that interpersonal. But I would wish that they can kind of slip into that subjective position to say, oh, if it's a phase, great. If not, okay. Like it's okay to play around with being a Red Sox fan or a Tampa Bay Rays fan. Like it's okay to kind of play around with that, and before one collapses into the collapses into a stabilized subjectivity that you'll have for the rest of your life, possibly. And I like that. I like those parents who, and again, like I think what you just said about if those parents were to voice into a larger like national community about like, well, maybe it is a phase, they would probably be shouted down by leftists. And but at the interpersonal level, they can be open to maybe it is, but and maybe it's not. Like it's what it is right now. And obviously there are parents who would come down very hard if their kid were to identify differently. But those are not the parents that I'm speaking of in my social group. The ones I'm like, they're just kind of like, they're not making any call on it right now, and I don't know if they ever will. Like they're just leaving it open.
Oof, I'm I would be curious, and it's impossible to get the data, but like comorbidity data, especially like abuse, um, the few trans kids I know don't have good family lives, and so
Yeah.
but that just it connects back to the theme that I always bring up is the physical, mental, and spiritual like attacks that we've faced as a people. I may I don't wanna go deal with getting diagnosed, but I've hit the point where I'm pretty sure I'm, like, autistic, um, and so I used to when I'd go out in public, I was programmed from a young age to, like, make eye contact, but I uh, I didn't know masking and mirroring, so I didn't realize that's what I was doing for so many years of my life. I hate making eye contact a lot of times because I see into people's fucking souls, and all I see in the world around me lately is just sadness and hurt.
Mhm.
And then I'm not like wicked smart, but I'm above average. And so I see pain in people and I see dysfunctional systems. And it's really hard to exist at times. And so, in my post uh post state world, I call it the stateless society. That's kind of like what I want to help and venture for. I think we would have fewer trans people, but we would also have fewer trans issues. Like the few trans people that did exist would m- be able to find communities relatively easily, accepting communities relatively easily. It does get complex. I think about like Ben Shapiro. If Ben Shapiro's kid came out as trans, man, I would feel so bad for that kid because like right, like, and so I'm not even like super
Yeah.
like I don't support like super affirmation, but I also don't support super demonization. If I were to be put in that position, it would be so tough for me, and I acknowledge that.
Mhm.
But so I feel bad for those other kids, but so much of my belief system is I'm tired of people
That's
virtue signaling. If you
yeah.
see a problem, it's your responsibility to go out into your community and do something about it.
And that's interesting because I would, if I had a perfect sort of utopian society in my head, we'd all be trans. Like we would all, to me, the state apparatus is the thing, whether the state apparatus is a government institute or an economic system or a religion, whatever. And we're a psychological model, like the Oedipus model, that we have to sort of collapse our subjectivities into, and we are coerced into doing that a billion tiny little ways every single day. And like, so the state is what puts and what solidifies the categories that trans movements try to move around, move under, dissolve. And so in a stateless, and again, this is just my opinion, in a stateless, or it's one not mine, it's one I'm just offering, in a stateless sort of social organization, there would be fewer and fewer of those oughts. You ought to do this. And there would be fewer of the constructed categories that are only constructed to benefit a certain persons. And therefore, the trans energy, like the trans flow of just wanting to go, 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 and connect, 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 without having all of the categories sort of putting barriers into what I can connect to or how I can conceive of myself and be in this world. I think in a stateless situation, there would be less and less and less of those categories. And therefore, I mean, I think we all are trans. I mean, we are, our subjectivities are wild, and it's just like, as we grow, our parents say do this, don't do that, do this, like those, that box just gets formed, and you have a certain space your subjectivity can play in, and certain categories that it has to stay within. And if you go outside, you're going to get in trouble. And obviously we all test the boundaries. That's what puberty is all about. But we test those boundaries, and by transgressing a category and then stepping back into like the safe zone, and then stepping back out, so that we can maybe build a little, we can push that side of the balloon a little further. And but there is that sort of sanctified and validated subjective experience you're supposed to have. And I think at root, that's a construct, that is a state construct. And that in a perfect society, there'd be less of those hindrances to the absolute flow of our subjective experience of being alive.
I dig what you're saying. I I no, I do. When I brought up the yin and the yang earlier, I really love
Yeah.
that sort of concept. I do believe that there are some universal principles. So, like the universal principle of gender does exist, but when you reframed the stateless society, I've always had a rigid construction of like institutions and governments, and there's boxes. But when you said it, all of the boxes disappeared. They deconstructed, and my brain was empty. It was stateless. There was no state, and it was really cool because I don't agree like everybody would be transgender, but I do believe everybody would flow within their identity so much better. But I do think that their identity is part of this experience on this planet. I'm inclined to believe there's reincarnation, and so right now you and I were having this experience right now.
So
We
how does
have
that coincide with like maybe an Eastern idea that the self is an illusion, and like to me, because I would agree with the idea that the self is an illusion, and I would sort of, I'd say identity is an illusion. It's a constructed product essentially that we've been sold.
it
There's no,
is.
if the self is an illusion, if identity is an illusion, then that would not be, in my understanding, it would not be an inherent part of our experience. It would be a sort of add-on to limit it.
I think it's a necessary component. The
Okay.
the identity is a data transmission device, and so the identity, the universe wants unlimited experience, right? And so right now I'm getting the experience of Andrew with these certain inhibitions, maybe as a result from the social constructs, the state constructs, the
Mm-hmm.
language constructs, right? So I do fundamentally believe that there's gender, right? So male, female energies, forces, polarity within the universe. I myself possess a balance of some masculine and some feminine forces, energies, traits, characteristics. And me transmitting my experience back to source or the universe, simultaneously, um, that's the point of this existence. It can't experience itself without the perception of division, which is the illusion.
Mm-hmm.
So the illusion is like sort of the perception of division. Because if the universe knew that I knew and I could feel the connection and I knew the connection was there, then it would be pointless. But
Yeah.
because there's that illusion and that lack of like, so this is me speculating, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that lack of full knowledge is the experience. And in a stateless society, I would have fewer inhibitions. Totally. I would be a more fluid person, but and this is just me sort of pondering or speculating, but I still don't think everyone would be trans. I think everyone
I,
would just be more open. Like I still
yeah.
think we
So
would
when,
see.
so when I say trans, I'm definitely not
Yeah.
meaning just transgender. I would think,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And again, I think that transgender subjectivities are subjectivities that trans energy of trying to go over categories and be free is just kind of in that is in that register of gender and sex issues. So something like, Buckminster, I mean, we could say like he's like trans architectural or whatever, like, and I think that there would be just more trans, probably more transgender, but also more trans architectural and more trans religious and more trans. There would just be more of that root subjectivity of moving, because there would be less categories and boundaries holding in, and so there'd be more flow out. And I do, like when we were talking about, like, anarchism back in there, and I kind of mentioned that I think there are moments when there's a spontaneous um, uh, the state arises spontaneously for someone's health or for a good cause, like the mother just grabbing the kid's hand, not asking the kid, do I have your permission to grab your hand, like just grabs the hand and pulls the kid out of the front of the car. Like that's a legitimate moment of a state coming in. And I do think, and I kind of mentioned that I think psychologies are like the Oedipus complex is a particular sort of state that is, the Western psyche has that running, that has that operational sort of state running it on its hardware. But and I do think that that's, again, in our system that keeps me having a job. It keeps it hinders me. It keeps certain impulses in place and in check. And then maybe in a stateless society, that Oedipus sort of psychological model, psychological state dissipates and disappears. But I would agree. I think that there at the very least has to be a spontaneous, stabilized psychology that bubbles up at a particular moment that is beneficial to like the individual animal that I am, that would give me mate, food, pleasure, whatever. So I'm not like, I don't think in a purely like stateless society there's no like individuals, like it's not like a merging collective sort of thing. It would just be that each individual, whether that, however it works, what if their trans interest, like the avenue, the path, that all of that movement, that trans energy of just flowing, if that's aimed towards architectural, if it's aimed towards religion and the experience of nirvana or grace, if it's aimed towards sexuality issues, like, each person will have their own sort of path that they just go down. And the other maybe avenues, again, I can like, and I can't name a historic figure, but I know I've heard of them, like these geniuses who just basically have no sex life. They could give two shits about a gender conversation or sexuality conversation, because they're just so breaking down every sort of boundary in their art going in this direction. And I think that like a stateless society would have that, like there'd be, I think, more trans movement, but it doesn't necessarily mean there would be like less identity. It just may be a more fluid identity. Like that if all of a sudden, like, I'm a great playwright or I'm a great religious thinker and I'm just going past like all these previous boundaries that were in the place, but they've all been removed because there's no more state. And then one day I just turn all that trans energy towards another pursuit. That may start to, I've kind of trained my mind, my soul to be fluid and to kind of like generate a little more porous walls of what my identity is. And so I think identities would be not eliminated per se, but a lot more interesting.
I agree, and kind of exactly. That's exactly what I picture a stateless society would be like. There would be fewer boundaries, fewer barriers, more diversity of architecture, diversity of identity. People how they dress. I have long hair and a
Yeah.
beard, and people always tell me, "Cut your hair and shave your beard and get a real job." Right? Like we're 2025, and people still say that shit. Um, So no, I agree completely, and that's why I'm vehemently anti-communist, I'm anti-socialist, anti-collectivist, because collectivism centralizes power and resources, but it also centralizes language, and it centralizes these categories and these boxes. And in that centralization process, we lose the individual. And so, yeah, that's
And I would add to that list of sort of collectivist situations or organizations. You know, I don't want to call it capitalism, like how you're understanding it, but like the state cronyism that we have right now. Like I think that's also collective, and then like the ideology that it pushes out. I think that's very collective as well. And just say,
neoliberalism.
yeah,
Yeah,
because again, like
neoliberalism. It is very collectivist.
yeah. So I would I would include that in that list.
Yeah, the modern day affairs of neoliberalism has been a shit show for the entire globe. Each country, like you can't find one country that doesn't have like a few major issues. um all goes back to the ruling class, in my opinion. But this has
Yep.
been really good. I have to pee.
Okay.
So I think it's a good place to kind of wrap it up
Yeah.
with a lot of agreement. But you want to remain anonymous, but is there anything you want to shout out, like any website, any social
No,
media?
no, not necessarily. I try to stay as anonymous as possible. I had a years and years ago, I had a run in with someone online, and they brought the trouble to my house, and so I at that point I kind of went on. I kind of said, okay, I'm doing everything under the radar.
No, I totally get it. I don't have a wife. I don't have kids. I don't have anything. So like, I don't really need anonymity. This could this could bite me in the butt in 10 years, but like, I don't know, who knows? But my whole goal was just to have a good conversation.
Yeah.
And I accomplished that. So thank you very much, Augustus, for this. I'm gonna end the live, but we might still be connected. We can kind of
All right.
end there. Boom.